Daniel had always been a man of routine. Every morning he woke up at 6 a.m. sharp, brewed his coffee, and headed to work before the sun had fully risen. He was known in the office as someone who got things done, efficient, reliable, and ambitious. But outside of work, life wasn't so simple. At home, Daniel felt like he was drowning. His marriage to Sarah, once filled with laughter and dreams, had become a battleground of misunderstandings and silent resentment. Sarah tried her best to keep things together. She cooked meals, managed the bills, and even attempted to surprise Daniel with little gestures, a handwritten note here, a favorite dessert there. But no matter what she did, it never seemed enough. Daniel was distant, buried under the weight of his responsibilities. To him, the house felt suffocating, the arguments endless. He loved Sarah, or at least he thought he did, but love alone couldn't fix the growing cracks in their relationship. One evening, after another long day at the office, Daniel walked into the kitchen to find Sarah sitting at the table, her face pale with worry. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The conversation quickly spiraled into an argument about money, missed anniversaries, and promises broken on both sides. Voices rose, tears fell, and by the end of it, Daniel felt more defeated than ever. "I can't do this anymore," he finally snapped, grabbing his keys from the counter. "I need some space." "Space?" Sarah repeated, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What does that even mean?" But Daniel didn't answer. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. For hours he drove aimlessly through the city streets, replaying the fight in his mind. By the time he returned, late at night, he had made up his mind. Early the next morning, while Sarah was still asleep, Daniel packed a suitcase with a few essentials and left a short note on the dining table. "I'm sorry. I'll call you soon." He didn't call, not that day, not the next week, not even months later. Instead, Daniel moved to a new city, leaving behind everything familiar. At first, guilt gnawed at him constantly. He wondered how Sarah was coping, whether she hated him for walking away. But as weeks turned into months, the guilt began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, Daniel felt free, from the fights, the pressure, the overwhelming feeling of failure. Or so he told himself. What Daniel didn't know, and what Sarah discovered just weeks after his departure, was that she was pregnant. Not with one child, but 4. Quadruplets. The news came as a shock, even to Sarah, who had already been struggling to make ends meet. She sat alone in the doctor's office, clutching the ultrasound picture, her mind racing. How would she raise 4 babies on her own? And what about Daniel? Did he deserve to know? In the end, Sarah decided against telling him. Her pride, mixed with anger and fear, stopped her. If Daniel couldn't handle their life together, how could he possibly handle this? So she tucked the ultrasound photo away in a drawer and resolved to face the future alone. Little did she or Daniel know that destiny had other plans, ones that would bring them back together in ways neither of them could have imagined. Months turned into years, and Daniel threw himself into building a new life. The city he moved to was bustling with opportunities, and he quickly climbed the corporate ladder. His days were filled with meetings, deadlines, and networking events, while his nights were spent in a small apartment that felt emptier with each passing year. At first, the change energized him. He told himself this was what he needed, a fresh start, a chance to focus on himself without distractions. But as time went on, the excitement faded, replaced by something deeper and harder to ignore: loneliness. Daniel dated occasionally, meeting women through friends or online apps. Some relationships lasted a few weeks. Others barely made it past the second date. No matter how hard he tried, none of them clicked. There was always something missing, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Late at night, when the world outside his window grew quiet, he sometimes thought about Sarah. He wondered how she was doing, if she had found happiness without him. Guilt would creep in then, but he pushed it away, convincing himself that he'd done the right thing by leaving. After all, their marriage had been falling apart long before he walked out the door. To distract himself, Daniel poured even more energy into work. Promotions came along with bigger paychecks and fancier titles. Yet no matter how successful he became, there was an ache inside him that refused to go away. It wasn't just guilt, it was regret. Regret for the promises he hadn't kept, for the arguments he'd let escalate, for the person he used to be before life got so complicated. Sometimes he caught glimpses of families at restaurants or parks, parents laughing with their kids, and felt a pang of envy. Those moments reminded him of what he'd given up, though he rarely admitted it, not even to himself. Every now and then, Daniel considered reaching out to Sarah. He imagined picking up the phone, dialing her number, and hearing her voice after all these years. What would he say? Would she even want to hear from him? Each time, fear stopped him. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of facing the consequences of his choices. So instead, he stayed silent, burying those thoughts deep within him. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Sarah was busy creating a life full of love and laughter despite the challenges. She worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, leaning on her parents and close friends whenever things got tough. Raising quadruplets wasn't easy. There were sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and countless trips to the pediatrician. But Sarah wouldn't have traded it for anything. Her children were her pride and joy, 4 little miracles who brought light into her darkest days. They looked remarkably alike, with matching dimples and mischievous grins, but each had their own personality. One loved books, another was obsessed with cars, the third never stopped singing, and the fourth was the family clown, always making everyone laugh. As the years passed, Daniel's absence became less painful for Sarah. She stopped wondering what could have been and focused on what was, her beautiful children and the strength she discovered within herself. She forgave Daniel, not because she forgot, but because holding on to anger only weighed her down. Still, she often wondered what kind of man he'd become. Had he changed? Did he ever think about the family he left behind? Little did either of them know. Fate had plans to bring them face to face again. Their paths, once torn apart, were slowly converging, ready to collide in a way neither of them could predict. When that moment came, it would force Daniel to confront the choices he'd made and the lives he'd left behind, including the ones he didn't even know existed. Years had passed since Daniel last set foot in his hometown, but a work conference brought him back unexpectedly. The city looked different now, busier, louder, and somehow smaller than he remembered. As the conference wrapped up on its final day, Daniel decided to take a break from the formalities and stepped outside for some fresh air. He wandered aimlessly until he found himself in a park nearby. It was late afternoon, and the golden sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the grass. Families were scattered around, parents chatting on benches, kids chasing each other with laughter filling the air. Daniel spotted an empty bench near a playground and sat down, pulling out his phone to check emails. Work had become his constant companion over the years, a way to fill the silence that followed him everywhere. But as he scrolled absent-mindedly, something caught his attention. A burst of giggles coming from the direction of the swings. Curious, he glanced up and froze. 4 children, all identical right down to their matching outfits, were playing tag near the sandbox. Their energy was infectious. They darted around like fireflies, their movements perfectly synchronized despite the chaos. One would sprint ahead, only for another to catch up moments later, shouting triumphantly. Daniel couldn't look away. There was something mesmerizing about them, not just because they were quadruplets, but because they radiated pure joy. He watched intently, trying to figure out what it was about them that felt so familiar. Maybe it was the way one of them tilted her head when she laughed, or how another furrowed his brow in concentration while building a sandcastle. Whatever it was, it stirred something deep inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. As if, sensing his gaze, one of the children suddenly broke away from the group and ran toward him. Before Daniel could react, the little boy tripped over his own feet and stumbled into Daniel's legs, spilling a juice box he'd been holding onto Daniel's shirt. For a moment, both of them froze, the child wide-eyed with surprise, and Daniel, equally stunned by the unexpected collision. Then, realizing what had happened, the boy gasped. "I'm sorry," he exclaimed, his cheeks turning pink. "It's okay," Daniel said quickly, grabbing a napkin from his pocket to dab at the stain. "Accidents happen." The boy relaxed visibly, giving Daniel a sheepish grin before calling out to someone behind him. "Mommy, I spilled juice." That single word sent a jolt through Daniel. "Mommy?" His heart skipped a beat as he turned his head to see who approached. A woman walked toward them, her steps hurried yet calm. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her face was older, lines etched around her eyes and mouth. But there was no mistaking those features. It was Sarah. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Daniel stared at her, his mind racing. She looked different, stronger, more confident, but unmistakably the same person he'd left behind all those years ago. Sarah paused when she saw him, clearly as shocked as he was. The boy tugged at her hand, oblivious to the tension crackling between the two adults. "This man says it's okay," he chirped cheerfully. Sarah forced a smile, kneeling beside the boy to help clean up the mess. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice polite but guarded. "We're really sorry about this." "It's fine," Daniel replied, though his voice came out uneven. He wanted to ask a million questions. Why were they here? Who were these children? Why did they look so familiar? But before he could say anything else, Sarah stood up, brushing off her hands. "Come on, kids," she called out gently. "Let's go home." The quadruplets obeyed without hesitation, gathering their things and waving goodbye to Daniel as they followed Sarah out of the park. Daniel remained seated, watching them leave, his mind reeling. Something wasn't adding up, and he couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that his world was about to change forever. The encounter at the park lingered in Daniel's mind like an unfinished puzzle. He replayed every detail over and over. The laughter of the quadruplets, their striking resemblance to each other, and most of all, the brief exchange with Sarah. Something about it didn't sit right. Her polite but distant demeanor, the way she avoided meeting his eyes for too long. It felt like there was more to the story than she was letting on. And then there were the kids. Their energy, their smiles, even the way one of them tilted her head when she spoke. It stirred memories he couldn't quite place. That night, Daniel barely slept. Images of the children kept flashing in his mind, along with questions he couldn't answer. Who were they? Why did they look so familiar? And why hadn't Sarah mentioned them earlier? The thought gnawed at him until he decided he couldn't let it go. He needed answers. A few days later, after tracking down Sarah's address through mutual acquaintances, Daniel found himself standing outside her house. It wasn't grand or fancy, just a modest home with a small garden out front. Toys were scattered across the yard. A tricycle here, a soccer ball there, and the faint sound of giggling drifted through an open window. Taking a deep breath, Daniel knocked on the door. Sarah answered after a moment, looking surprised to see him. For a second, neither of them said anything. Then she stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," she said dryly, closing the door behind him. Inside, the house was warm and lived in, filled with signs of a busy family life. Drawings hung on the fridge, tiny shoes lined up by the door, and the smell of cookies baking wafted from the kitchen. The quadruplets were seated at the dining table, coloring pictures while chatting animatedly. When they noticed Daniel, they stopped mid-sentence, staring at him curiously. "Who's this, Mommy?" one of them asked, pointing at him. "This is an old friend," Sarah replied carefully, shooting Daniel a warning glance. She ushered the kids into the living room, turning on a cartoon to distract them before leading Daniel to the kitchen. Once they were alone, Daniel wasted no time. "Sarah, who are those kids?" he asked bluntly. "And why do they look so much like me?" She hesitated, her back turned as she pulled a tray of cookies out of the oven. For a moment, Daniel thought she might deny it altogether, But then she sighed heavily, setting the tray down and turning to face him. "They're yours," she admitted quietly. "Quadruplets. You left before I even knew I was pregnant." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. His knees nearly buckled beneath him as he sank into a chair, struggling to process what she'd just said. 4 children. His children. All this time, he'd been clueless, oblivious to the lives he'd unknowingly created and abandoned. "I didn't tell you because," Sarah trailed off, her voice trembling slightly, "because I didn't think you'd want to know. You made it clear you wanted space, Daniel. A clean break. How could I drag you into this when you already walked away once?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, but the weight of her words crushed him all the same. She wasn't wrong. He had walked away. He hadn't given her a choice. Yet now, standing in her kitchen surrounded by evidence of the family he never knew existed, Daniel felt the full force of his mistakes pressing down on him. Before either of them could say more, one of the children peeked into the kitchen. "Mommy, we're hungry," the little girl announced cheerfully. "In a minute," Sarah replied, forcing a smile for her daughter before turning back to Daniel. Her expression softened slightly, though her guard remained firmly in place. "This isn't about us anymore," she said. "It's about them. If you want to be part of their lives, fine. But don't expect things to go back to how they were. That ship sailed a long time ago." With that, she walked out of the kitchen, leaving Daniel sitting there, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he'd learned. The pieces of his past had finally caught up with him, and now, whether he was ready or not, they were demanding answers. Daniel sat in his car outside Sarah's house for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The revelation of the quadruplets weighed heavily on him, each word Sarah had spoken replaying in his mind. 4 children. His children. He couldn't wrap his head around it. How could he have missed so much? How could he not have known? The guilt was suffocating, but beneath it was something else, a flicker of determination. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of purpose pulling at him, urging him to step up. Over the next few days, he reached out to Sarah again, this time with a clear goal in mind. "I want to get to know them," he told her over the phone, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "They're my kids, Sarah. I owe them that much." Sarah hesitated. She wasn't sure she trusted him yet, and rightfully so. After all, he'd disappeared without a trace, leaving her to face one of the hardest challenges of her life alone. But she also knew her children deserved to know their father, if he was truly willing to be one. Reluctantly, she agreed to let him spend time with them under one condition. He had to take things slow. No grand gestures, no sudden attempts to play hero, just honesty and consistency. Their first proper meeting happened on a Saturday afternoon, at a local park, the same one where they'd crossed paths days earlier. Sarah brought the quadruplets along with snacks and a blanket to sit on. Daniel arrived nervously, unsure how to approach them. To the kids, he was still a stranger, and they regarded him with cautious curiosity. "Hi," he said awkwardly, kneeling down to their level. I'm Daniel. Your mom thought it would be fun if we got to know each other." The children exchanged glances, unsure what to make of him. One of them, the bold one who always seemed to lead the pack, stepped forward. "Are you our dad?" she asked bluntly, her big eyes locking onto his. Daniel swallowed hard, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Yes," he admitted softly. "I am." The room fell silent, or rather the park did. Even the distant chatter of other families seemed to fade into the background. The kids stared at him, processing this new information. Finally, the same child who had spoken earlier broke the silence. "Why weren't you here before?" Her question hit Daniel like a hammer. There was no malice in her tone, only innocent curiosity, but it cut deeper than any accusation ever could. He glanced at Sarah, silently pleading for help, but she simply shrugged. This was his moment to explain, to try at least. "I didn't know about you," he began carefully, "not until recently, and I'm so sorry for that. But now that I do, I want to be here, if you'll let me." The kids looked at each other, then back at him. Slowly, one by one, they nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. Far from it, but it was a start. Over the weeks that followed, Daniel made an effort to be present. He joined them for weekend outings, helped with school pickups when Sarah allowed it, and even attended a parent-teacher conference. At first, the children were reserved, testing his patience and sincerity. But Daniel didn't give up. He learned their names, Emma, Liam, Ava, and Noah, and memorized their quirks. Emma loved books and often carried one wherever she went. Liam was obsessed with dinosaurs and could rattle off facts about them endlessly. Ava had a knack for art, filling pages with colorful drawings, while Noah was the jokester, always ready with a silly face or prank. Each interaction brought Daniel closer to understanding not just his children, but also himself. He realized how much he'd missed by walking away. Not just the joy of being a father, but the lessons it taught him about love, responsibility, and humility. Sarah watched from a distance, her skepticism slowly giving way to cautious hope. She saw how hard Daniel was trying, and though she still held on to her reservations, she couldn't deny the positive impact he was having on their lives. One evening, as Daniel tucked the kids into bed after a long day at the zoo, Emma looked up at him and smiled. "You're fun, Dad," she said sleepily. It was the first time any of them had called him that, and it nearly brought tears to his eyes. In that moment, Daniel knew he had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel's bond with the quadruplets grew stronger. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was becoming part of their daily lives. Mornings began with phone calls from Emma asking if he'd read the new book she'd picked out, while afternoons were filled with impromptu soccer games in the backyard with Liam and Noah. Ava often dragged him to art stores, insisting he help her pick out supplies for her latest masterpiece. Each child brought something unique to his life, teaching him patience, humor, and the kind of unconditional love he'd never experienced before. But as much as Daniel cherished these moments, navigating his relationship with Sarah remained complicated. She appreciated his efforts but kept him at arm's length, refusing to let her guard down completely. Their conversations were polite but guarded, each word weighed carefully before being spoken. Old wounds still lingered between them, and though they both tried to focus on the kids, unresolved feelings often bubbled beneath the surface. One evening, tensions came to a head during a family dinner Daniel had organized at a local restaurant. It was meant to be a celebration. Liam had won a school science fair and everyone was excited to mark the occasion. But halfway through the meal, an argument erupted when Daniel suggested moving back to town permanently. "I want to be here for them," he explained, his tone earnest. "For all of you." Sarah frowned, setting her fork down. "You left us once, Daniel. What makes you think things will be different now?" Her words stung, but she wasn't wrong. The room fell silent as the kids looked nervously between their parents. Sensing the tension, Emma reached across the table and grabbed Daniel's hand. "We want you here, Dad," she said softly, her voice breaking the awkward silence. Her siblings nodded in agreement, their expressions hopeful. For a moment, Daniel felt like the luckiest man alive and also the most unworthy. He turned to Sarah, his eyes pleading. "I know I messed up, Sarah. I can't change the past, but I can make things right now. Let me try." Sarah hesitated, torn between protecting herself and giving him another chance. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. But don't make promises you can't keep." The fragile truce allowed Daniel to take bigger steps toward rebuilding trust. He rented an apartment close by, ensuring he could spend more time with the kids. Weekends became a whirlwind of activities, picnics, museum visits, and baking sessions that usually ended with flour covering every surface. Despite the chaos, Daniel found himself smiling more than he had in years. However, not everything went smoothly. There were days when old habits resurfaced, like when Daniel missed a school event because of work or forgot to call after promising he would. Each slip-up reignited Sarah's doubts, forcing Daniel to confront his flaws head-on. Yet every misstep also gave him a chance to prove he was serious about change. He apologized sincerely, made amends, and worked harder to follow through on his commitments. The turning point came one rainy afternoon when Daniel decided to surprise the kids with a trip to the aquarium. As they wandered through exhibits filled with colorful fish and playful otters, laughter echoed around them. At one point, Noah slipped on a wet floor and scraped his knee. Panic set in as tears streamed down his face, but Daniel sprang into action, carrying him to a nearby bench and gently cleaning the wound. "It's okay, buddy," Daniel reassured him, his voice calm despite the knot of worry in his stomach. "You're tough, remember? Just like your favorite superhero." Noah sniffled but managed a small smile. "Thanks, Dad." Watching from a distance, Sarah saw the tenderness in Daniel's actions, the way he comforted Noah without hesitation, putting aside his own fears to focus on his son. In that moment, she realized how far he'd come. He wasn't the same man who had walked out years ago. This version of Daniel was patient, present, and determined to do better, not just for the kids, but for all of them. By the end of the day, as they drove home with the kids fast asleep in the back seat, Sarah glanced at Daniel. "You're doing good," she said quietly, almost reluctantly. "They really love having you around." Her words were simple, but they meant the world to Daniel. For the first time since returning to their lives, he felt like he was finally earning his place, not just as a father, but as someone worthy of forgiveness. Daniel's transformation didn't happen overnight, but with each passing day he became more than just a man trying to fix his mistakes. He became a father. The quadruplets weren't the only ones who noticed the change. Even Sarah began to see glimpses of the person Daniel used to be before life and stress had worn him down. He was still far from perfect, but his determination to make amends was undeniable. One sunny Saturday morning, Daniel organized a family outing, a trip to the local fair. It was something the kids had been begging to do for weeks, and Daniel wanted to make it special. He arrived early at Sarah's house, armed with snacks, sunscreen, and a camera to capture every moment. The kids were ecstatic, bouncing around the car as they drove to the fairgrounds. Once there, the air buzzed with excitement. Colorful stalls lined the paths, music played in the background, and the smell of cotton candy wafted through the breeze. For hours, they explored everything the fair had to offer. Emma won a stuffed animal at a ring toss game, while Liam proudly showed off his aim by knocking down milk bottles at another booth. Ava painted her face with glittery designs, and Noah insisted on riding the Ferris wheel twice. Daniel laughed, along with them, snapping photos and cheering them on, feeling lighter than he had in years. For once, the weight of guilt and regret seemed distant, replaced by the simple joy of being present. But halfway through the afternoon, disaster struck. As they walked toward the petting zoo, Ava suddenly collapsed, clutching her stomach and crying out in pain. Panic surged through Daniel as he knelt beside her, his heart racing. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It hurts," Ava whimpered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Sarah rushed over, her face pale with worry. "We need to get her to a doctor," she said urgently. Without hesitation, Daniel scooped Ava into his arms and ran toward the parking lot, Sarah and the other kids trailing behind. The drive to the hospital felt endless, every second stretching like an eternity. At the emergency room, doctors quickly diagnosed Ava with appendicitis and prepared her for surgery. While Sarah stayed by Ava's side, Daniel took charge of keeping the other children calm, distracting them with stories and games until they could see their sister again. When Ava finally woke up after the procedure, groggy but safe, she looked up at Daniel and smiled weakly. "You saved me, Dad," she murmured. Daniel's throat tightened and he gently squeezed her hand. "I'll always be here to protect you, okay? Always." That night, as they sat together in the hospital waiting room, Sarah turned to Daniel, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't panic. You stepped up when it mattered most." Her words meant more to Daniel than she could have known. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just earning the trust of his children. He was slowly regaining Sarah's faith, too. Though their relationship remained complicated, the walls between them were beginning to crumble. Over the following weeks, Daniel continued to prove himself. He attended parent-teacher meetings, helped with homework, and even joined a weekend cooking class with the kids, which ended disastrously but hilariously. Each small act reinforced his commitment, not just to being a father, but to being someone his family could count on. The quadruplets thrived under his care, their laughter growing louder and their bond with him stronger. They taught him how to find beauty in the little things, a perfectly shaped cloud, a funny joke, or the warmth of holding hands during a walk. Through them, Daniel rediscovered parts of himself he thought he'd lost: patience, kindness, and the ability to love without reservation. Though reconciliation with Sarah remained a work in progress, Daniel no longer sought to undo the past. Instead, he focused on building a future, one filled with laughter, love, and second chances. And as he watched his children play together in the same park where their journey had begun, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, redemption comes not in grand gestures but in the quiet, everyday moments that remind you what truly matters. Months passed, and Daniel's life transformed in ways he never imagined possible. The once empty apartment he rented was now filled with colorful drawings taped to the fridge, tiny handprints on the walls, and the constant hum of laughter. He had officially moved back to town, trading his high-powered city job for a position closer to home. It paid less, but it allowed him the flexibility to be present for school plays, soccer matches, and bedtime stories. For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was living a life worth waking up for. The quadruplets adored having their dad around. Emma often curled up next to him while reading her favorite books, pointing out sentences she thought were extra cool. Liam proudly showed off his dinosaur collection, explaining each species with the enthusiasm of a budding paleontologist. Ava turned his living room into an art studio, covering every surface with paint and glitter, while Noah kept him on his toes with endless pranks and jokes. They weren't just his children anymore. They were his teachers, showing him how to see the world through fresh eyes. Sarah noticed the change too. While their romantic relationship remained firmly in the past, their co-parenting dynamic flourished. They worked together seamlessly, coordinating schedules, sharing responsibilities, and making decisions as a team. There were still moments of tension. Old wounds don't heal overnight, but they approached them differently now. Instead of anger or blame, there was understanding and compromise. One evening, as they sat on opposite ends of the couch going over the kids' school calendar, Sarah glanced at Daniel. "You've really changed," she said softly. "I didn't think you'd stick around this long." Daniel looked up, surprised by her candor. "I know I messed up before, Sarah, but these kids, they've given me a reason to be better. You have too." Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes stayed guarded. "Let's just take it one day at a time, okay?" He nodded, respecting her boundaries. Some things couldn't be rushed, and he was willing to wait, however long it took to rebuild trust completely. As the seasons changed, so did their family dynamics. Birthdays were celebrated with homemade cakes and backyard barbecues. Holidays brought traditions both new and old, carving pumpkins at Halloween, baking cookies at Christmas, and planting flowers in the spring. Each memory added another layer to the foundation they were rebuilding brick by brick. One crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel took the kids to the park where everything had started. Leaves crunched underfoot as they played tag, climbed trees, and chased ducks by the pond. Watching them laugh and run freely, Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude. These 4 little miracles had turned his world upside down, in the best way possible. Later that evening, as he tucked them into bed, Emma hugged him tightly. "Dad, we're glad you're here," she whispered sleepily. His heart swelled with emotion. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." That night, as Daniel stood in the doorway watching his children sleep, he realized something profound. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about creating a future worth fighting for. He hadn't been the father or husband he should have been before, but he was determined to be the man his family needed now. And though challenges lay ahead, he faced them with hope, knowing that love, forgiveness, and second chances could overcome almost anything. Under the glow of a bedside lamp, Daniel smiled to himself. Life wasn't perfect, but it was whole, and that was more than enough.